Well, if you got your Bible, and I hope you do, Daniel chapter 6 is where we're going to be. Here's the question. Is it ever right for a Christian to disobey the law? That's the question that the text answers this morning. Is it ever right for a Christian, or I'll go further, is it ever warranted or required for a Christian to disobey the law in order to express fidelity to God? You're like, oh, is it going to be one of those mornings? It's totally going to be one of those mornings. So if you brought your friend, tell him to come back next week. Is there a chance I'll be offended? 100%. So Daniel chapter 6 is where we're at, and this is a really weird time to preach this sermon. This is one of the reasons that we preach kind of chapter by chapter, book by book through the Bible, because we don't get to avoid the stuff that we would avoid if we could just kind of, hunt and peck and pick the things we like to talk about and avoid the things we don't like to talk about. I came to this text this week and I was like, Lord, come on, really? Really? Of all the weeks to preach this sermon, like this week, and this is why this week I think is interesting to preach the sermon. Number one, it was Thanksgiving weekend, right? And so hopefully you celebrated Thanksgiving this weekend with family and friends and enjoyed the many blessings of God. Amen. So here's why we celebrate Thanksgiving. Anybody know why? Because a group of people got tired of being told how they could or couldn't worship God. So they got on a boat and braved the Atlantic Ocean. I wouldn't even go out on Fish Lake. They braved the Atlantic Ocean to come across to America so they can worship freely. Okay? That's what we celebrated this weekend, Thanksgiving. The second reason this is kind of an awkward sermon to preach is that we're in week 2 now of being told we're not allowed to sing at church by our governor. Now, the story we're going to read is where there's a guy in the Old Testament told he can't pray for 30 days. We've been told we can't sing for 30 days. Okay, and let's just make the explicit ties because they're there, and if I try to ignore them, you'll make them in your mind anyways, so let's just put them on the table. This is kind of weird, right? Third reason this is a kind of an interesting sermon to preach this week is this week there was a landmark ruling. Supreme Court of the United States of America ruled, it was a weird experience reading the ruling and hearing they ruled for common sense. This I'm not used to reading this recently, and so I actually read the entire ruling to our family at Thanksgiving dinner. I got to the very end, and they all started cheering and clapping. So this is a moment, right? This is a moment that we don't get to experience that often. Here's what makes it weirder. Right now in Washington State, it's legal for me tomorrow to go, I could marry a dude while smoking a joint, while gambling in a casino with hundreds of people, on my way out to burn down a police precinct, while riding in the streets and squatting in public areas indefinitely, destroying private property, end the day by taking my girlfriend to go kill our baby because it might interfere with the career aspirations of my girlfriend. Okay? And all that would be heralded as patriotism by certain people in power in our state, but it's illegal for you to sing Amazing Grace on Sunday morning. That's where we're at right now. And this isn't about, the intention of this message isn't to get political, but to be prophetic. Because many of Americans find themselves stuck on this left and right spectrum. And there's the spectrum that goes to the right, there's a spectrum that goes to the left, and there's things that kind of make us feel like we got to hold our nose wherever we're on the spectrum. And if you feel uncomfortable somewhere on the political spectrum, it's because you weren't made for the American political spectrum. You were made to live not left or right, but kingdom down. There's a throne and there's a God who sits on it. And so my intention this morning isn't to encourage you to the right or to the left, but encourage you up, to look up to the throne of heaven where God's king sits on his throne this morning, ruling perfectly and reigning mightily over all of the earth. And so as Christians, we're constantly trying to figure out how to live in the tension of being faithful to God and then loving the people that we are called to love and live around. And so it is an interesting time. And so we're in this moment where it's just hard to know what to think. It's hard to know what to believe. And you have on this side of the coin right now the kind of the face mask brigade. You know what I'm talking about? It's like if you don't wear a face mask, you're actively killing the world, a zombie apocalypse, and it's all going to come to an end. And then over here on this side of the spectrum, you have face masks are the mark of the beast, okay? And it's like putting a swastika on my face. It's a sign of, cowering to tyranny and blah, 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 blah. And then most of us are kind of somewhere probably in the middle, right? It's like how is this working? So you got social distance wars, you got face mask wars, you got science and data wars. Don't we just love that phrase anymore? Science and data, right? Obviously, there's nothing scientific about anything we're doing, but let's just invoke that phrase to then excuse whatever kind of crazy idea we want to put in motion. And I've had the thought multiple times, if science and data matters, let's talk about the science and data of when life starts and how many people we kill before they even get a chance to live life. 17,000 babies last year alone. Scientifically and data proven to be the highest cause of death in the state of Washington by orders of magnitude beyond anything we're facing right now. And yet, if you bring up it appears as if old sick people are dying, you get yelled at, as I saw one press conference recently. No, that's ageism. That's ageism. And then we get lectured. Makes it even better. We get lectured about the sanctity of life. And this is literally in a press conference this week. I saw it doesn't matter how old they are, which I agree with. Life is valuable at every age. I thought, I agree with that. Isn't it adorable to be lectured about the sanctity of life by people who are actively working so that 17,000 to 18,000 precious children this year won't make it home? Strange times indeed. Strange times indeed. Justice Gorsuch wrote in his majority position that government is not free to disregard the First Amendment in times of crisis. At a minimum, that amendment prohibits government officials from treating religious exercise worse than comparable secular activities. And yet at the same time, governors in our nation have chosen to impose no capacity restrictions on certain businesses that they consider essential. And it turns out businesses the governor considers essential include hardware stores, acupuncturists, and liquor stores, bicycle repair shops, certain signage companies, accountants, lawyers, and insurance agents are all essential too. So, at least according to the governor, it may be unsafe to go to church, but it is always fine to pick up another bottle of wine, shop for a new bike, or spend the afternoon exploring your distal points and meridians. Who knew public health would so perfectly align with secular convenience? As almost everyone in the court today recognizes, squaring the governor's edicts with our traditional First Amendment rules is no easy task. Of course, he's writing in relationship to Governor Cuomo's restrictions put on churches in New York. People may gather inside for extended periods of time at bus stations, airports, laundromats, banks, hardware stores, liquor shops. No apparent reason exists why people may not gather subject to identical restrictions in churches or synagogues, especially when religious institutes have made plain they stand ready, able, willing to be safe, precautions, blah, 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 blah. Indeed, Governor is remarkably frank about this. In his judgment, laundry and liquor, travel, and tools are all essential, while traditional religious exercises are not. That is exactly the kind of discrimination the First Amendment forbids. Nor is the problem an isolated one. In recent months, certain governors across our country have issued similar edicts. At the flick of a pen, they have asserted their right to privilege restaurants, marijuana dispensaries, and casinos over churches, mosques, and temples. In far too many places for far too long, our first freedom has fallen on deaf ears. Even if the Constitution has taken a holiday during this pandemic, it cannot become a long-term sabbatical. Rather than apply a non-binding expired concurrence from South Bay, which was a case they ruled against earlier this year, courts must resume applying the free exercise clause of the Constitution. Today, a majority of the court makes this plain. It is time, past time. I'm editing here. This is longer than I'm just grabbing pieces. It is time, past time, to make plain that while the pandemic poses many grave challenges, there is no world in which the Constitution tolerates color-coded executive edicts that require liquor stores and bike shops to stay open, but shutter churches, synagogues, and mosques. That was the part where my family started cheering when I read that to them. Who wants to live in a world where one person can wake up and decide you can't go to work, you can't open your business, you can't educate your kid, you can't go to church, you can't sing at church, you can't have anyone over to your house for dinner? And yet that's the world we're living in. It's wild. It's bonkers. So I don't really even care where you're at on the political spectrum. I want all of us to agree that things are a little unique right now. okay? If we just all get there, things are just a little unique. And I'm not even wanting to win you over to one position or the other. I want us to learn how to think critically and biblically, because my experience has been, at least with pastors, their thinking, the relationship to this area is weak. Not because they're bad people, not because they're lazy, but because we have not had the need to think critically about these kind of issues before living under the warm blanket of freedom that we haven't enjoyed up until 2020. Justice Alito said we are living in a season of unprecedented government malfeasance we have not seen since the Declaration of Independence. Now, you may think Justice Alito is a quack, but you can't ignore one of the greatest legal minds of our time pointing out a very serious issue, in his words saying, the ramifications of which we will live with long after this virus is forgotten. And so we have to think critically as the church, or we won't love the community we've been called to love well, and we won't follow God faithfully in which we've been called to do. I've had many interesting talks with pastors. You should know they're not doing well. 1 in 5 churches will close their doors in 2021 in direct result to restrictions that have been placed on them from COVID-19. 70% of pastors polled in the last 2 months said they would quit if they could afford it. 30% of pastors record right now they are at suicidal level depression and discouragement. And that's just inside the church. Churches are dying. Churches are weary. It's reflecting everything going on around us in the culture. And the question I've had posed to me by pastors is, are you one of those constitutional Christians? And it's just a sign of the Spirit of God that I'm not in jail right now. When I get asked that question by other pastors, it blows my mind. I say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, are you one of those constitutional Christians? It's God, guns, and faith and family. I'm like, well, I have no problem with any of those. But what's the point you're making? Well, as Christians, we're called to follow the Bible, not the Constitution. And I go, that's really lazy thinking. And here's what I mean when I say it's lazy thinking. Was Paul a Roman Christian? Absolutely he was. He was a Roman of Romans. He knew the law better than the Romans knew the law. And this is the guy that told us to be a good citizen, you need to be involved and engaged with the nation state that you live in, which means you need to understand how it's organized, you need to understand its governing principles, so you can participate in that nation in a way that edifies it, strengthens it, and builds it up. Which I take to mean I can't be a good Christian unless I understand how the nation I live in is organized. And we happen to live in a nation that's organized itself around what we call the Constitution. How many of you think we're a democracy? Don't raise your hand. We're not a democracy. It's just mind-boggling to me that we think, what's the mark of a democracy? Majority wins. Do you want to be a part of a nation where majority wins? No, you don't. If you're a part of a system where the majority always wins, that means the minority is always oppressed, which is exactly what the United States was designed to avoid. We are a constitutional republic, which means we have a constitution that functions as the highest power, not a governor, not a mayor, not a president, not a king, not an emperor, but a constitution that we all agree to, which, by the way, I don't think we can improve upon. We are a republic, meaning all are represented. Every voice counts, every vote matters, and it's represented in men and women we vote for to represent us in the process of making laws, and it's divided and organized in such a way that even minorities can have a representative voice. It's a brilliant system. I'll go further than that, and I'll say I think that the Constitution is one of the most brilliant living documents, and when I say living, I don't mean living as inflexible to mean what we want it to mean in every given moment, like some judges think it means, but I mean living document as an active document governing a current nation. I'm not sure you could get a document that more closely reflects a Christian worldview without going into a theocracy where like the church runs the state. I read the Constitution to our kids four times on our road trip this summer. Don't you wish you were one of my kids? and we read the Declaration of Independence multiple times on our road trip this summer. And we read statements that were given by the men of that time. And you read statements like, we hold these truths to be self-evident, meaning they're so obvious as to need no proof. We hold these truths to be self-evident that how many men? All men are created equal and given by their Creator. They are endowed by their Creator unalienable rights. Among these rights, of course, life, the pursuit of happiness, so on and so forth. You read through that and you think, I'm not sure you can improve on this. Like, this is really, really good. This is really, really good. And so when I'm asked, are you one of those constitutional Christians? I go, well, God tells me to be an involved, active citizen to work for the flourishing of the nation in which I'm given, which means I need to know how that nation functions. And our nation is built on the foundation of the Constitution, which means if I want to be a good, involved, faithful, Spirit-filled, Bible-believing Christian, I need to understand how this whole system works. You know the statistics for grown adults that can't name the 3 branches of government in our nation? They're embarrassing, let alone make an intelligent case for the need for separation of powers, whether it's historically or legal theory. I'm not saying all of us should be attorneys. I'm saying we should have at least a working knowledge of where we're at, why we got there, and if there are fences there we don't like, we should at least examine historically why they're there before we tear them down. Am I a constitutional Christian? My gosh, I'm a Christian that lives in a nation that has a constitution, so I think I should at least be aware of it. You read Paul in Acts, and in Acts chapter 22, they're gonna whip him, and he goes, do you make a case of whipping Roman citizens without a trial first? And they're like, holy crap, back the train up here, we just about committed a felony. Why? Because Paul knew the rules. Because Paul was a constitutional Christian. My gosh, this isn't hard, pastors. And then for 6 chapters, he's suing the Roman government. I mean, he just goes right at them. And he's forcing them to deal with their own hypocrisy because he knows the rules. And then God tells him, don't let your lawsuit up because you need to go all the way to Rome and proclaim the gospel there. I mean, if you have any sense of history and Bible knowledge, these are crazy times to be alive. Thrilling and exciting and crazy, which means we're going to have to think better and be better than we've ever had to think or be before, which is good news for the church. Good news for the church. And so we're back to our original question. Is there ever a moment when it's warranted or even required for a Christian to disobey the law? And the reason this is a challenging question is because Christians have a high value of rule of law, don't we? Say amen. Okay, good. We do. The reason we have a high value of the rule of law is because the rule of law is tied to the law of God. When you disconnect rule of law from the law of God, problems. I've had some ask me recently, do you think this is the church's Bonhoeffer moment? And I say no. And they're like, whew. And then I say, I think Bonhoeffer waited way too long. If you're familiar with Bonhoeffer, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, extraordinary theologian, pastor, prophet, living in Germany during World War II, pre-World War II, he was a pacifist. And either because he was a coward or he had a tender conscience, he chose not to say anything, write anything, or do anything until he was so convicted about what was happening in his nation. He went from a pacifist through an extraordinary journey that he documents in his journals that you can read of a man wrestling with his convictions. He went from a pacifist to deciding he needed to hatch a plan to kill Hitler. Now that's a big swing, wouldn't you say? And what I'm saying is, while he may be an example of courage in the face of fire, he's not a good example for when to draw the line. He waited far too long. When they're baking your Jewish friends in human ovens, it's gone too far. I would just as soon draw the line a few steps back, never get there and have to deal with that. Hatch a plan to kill Hitler. Had the church been speaking up louder, longer, earlier, we might have never had World War II. So is this our Bonhoeffer moment? I hope it's not, and I don't want to wait for it. I want to stand sooner, clearer, earlier than to wait for that moment to come. And if you think, well, this is kind of drastic, friend, you could disagree with everything I've said to this point, and that is totally, totally fine. But I want to encourage you with this: your time is coming. There's not a person in this room that will not have the opportunity to decide, stand or sit, speak or shut up, draw a line, or walk away. It's coming. And so you may not think, you may disagree with Justice Alito and say, this isn't a big deal. And by the way, this isn't going away. Pandora's box has been opened. Like, we're in it right now. Like, things have fundamentally changed in our nation, so just buckle that one on. That's already happened. How do we live in it? That's the question now for churches and for Christians and for pastors and for human beings. And you may think, well, I don't think it's that big a deal right now. That's okay. But if you're a follower of Jesus, you will get the opportunity. In fact, how many of you, now by a show of hands, already know you can't say things or do some things or express some things at work, or you'll be ostracized or you'll lose your job, right? You're like, well, this is radical. I mean, they told Daniel he couldn't pray to God for 30 days. We wouldn't tell our people, really? Can you think of any place where lots of people gather publicly, children particular in our community, where you're not allowed to pray, not just for 30 days, but forever? Well, it's already happened, people. We are further into Babylon, and we've just been lulled to sleep. Like, oh, it's going to be okay, it won't happen to me. Oh, okay, your time's coming. Your time's coming where you're going to get to choose, stand, sit, speak out, not say anything, and friends, you can only hide for so long. And so this question of whether or not it's okay for a Christian to disobey the law is a warranted question in wild times that I want every one of you to wrestle with, not in applying it tomorrow, because we have law enforcement sitting in the room right now looking at me going, are you encouraging people to go out and break the law? Not even close. Well, let's see where we go. Let's see, the sermon isn't over yet. It's one of those mornings. I haven't slept for 2 weeks, so my filters are all gone. So this is just, it's dangerous for everybody right now. Daniel chapter 6 is where we're going to go. And what's wild about this story is I had always read this story in the context of kids' one-dimensional flannel graphs. You know what I mean? Daniel, lion's pit, throws in, he pets them, he lives, whee! And I had never realized how deeply political this story is and how deeply relevant this story is to the moment that we're in. And this is why we preach the Bible left to right, because you can't plan for this kind of stuff. When I planned out Daniel months and months and months ago, there's no way I could even possibly fathom that I would preach Daniel 6 about not being able to pray for 30 days in the middle of being told we can't sing for 30 days. You just can't make this stuff up. Here we are. It's like, oh, Lord, come on. Okay, let's go. We're going to have this conversation. We're going to totally have this conversation. Daniel chapter 6 is going to have it for us. Here we go. Daniel's exceptionalism. Verse 1. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom. What's that? That's politics. That's governance. That's constitution. So you're like, I thought Nebuchadnezzar or Belshazzar, yeah, they're dead. They're gone. This is new government now. This is going to be the third and fourth king that Daniel has served under in this pagan demonic kingdom. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. So you get that? The infrastructure there? 120 satraps, they're like judge meets like governor meets like sheriff, spread out over the kingdom to ensure rule of law and order. And over those 120 are 3. And one of those 3 is Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Verse 3, now Daniel was so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Here's what's remarkable about this. We know that Daniel is a faithful follower of Yahweh, that he is a man of courage, he's a man of conviction, he's a man of values. He will not compromise what he believes, and he has made it to essentially the number 2 person in a wildly evil, secular, demonic kingdom, the Medes and Persians. Why? Because Daniel was an exceptional human being. Here's the big idea. Whatever your hand finds to do it with all of your might. If you are a spirit-filled follower of Jesus, you will be an asset to any person in any company, in any business, in any government job, because you're there not working for them, you're there working for God. The cardinal sin on my team is to be okay with mediocrity. You want to fire me up? You want to tick me off? You want to bug me? Just be ho-hum about your job and not care about the small things. There's nothing that drives me crazier looking around the world than people who have something good to do, whether it's a plumber or a sheetrocker or a lawn care provider, and they just kind of do it just kind of so-so. Conversely, there's nothing more thrilling to me than to see someone doing whatever they may be doing with all of their might, with exceptionalism and excellence. And you think, why? Well, why all the effort? Because I'm not doing it for them, I'm doing it for him. So whether you're a student right now, or whether you're a plumber, or you're an electrician, or you're a teacher, or whatever you are, whatever you do, you're there by assignment to do whatever you do as best as you can do it unto the Lord, not to man, like Daniel did. He excelled in this political role to the point where there was, Medes and Persians, massive global kingdom, and there's nobody else better in the entire kingdom to do this job than Daniel. Speaks highly to his abilities to function in a very complicated world in a way that was faithful to God. Verse 4, let's look at Daniel's integrity. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, "May King Darius live forever." The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into a lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put the decree in writing. What's happening there? Daniel is a political animal. He's a political beast. He's a political person functioning in a highly competitive and corrupt political world. They're jealous because he's getting picked over them to rule over them, and so they hatch a plan. They're gonna do a fake news smear campaign against his character, except they can't find anything. Now, let's just stop now without showing hands. How many of you have things that could be found if someone looked hard enough? These guys looked high and low and couldn't find a thing because of Daniel's exceptional character and quality of integrity. And so they said the only thing we can do here to get him is to attach something to his faith. Question, do you have a strong enough faith and a public enough faith that you could be burned for it? Like would they go, you know what? Here's how we'll get Joe. Here's how we'll get Sally. She is so committed to her faith that if we can figure out a way to create a law that would be in violation of her faith, We got her, because we know she won't compromise her faith. That's a reputation, isn't it? Here's the big idea. Your work is your witness. Your work is your witness. Don't think, well, I'll be a witness at my city group, or, well, I'll be a witness on Sunday with my big smile. No, what you do where you work, that's your witness. Do you do it with excellence? Do you do it with integrity? Do you do it with pride? Do you do it with exceptionalism? Do you do it with all of your might? And do you do it in such a way that there's nobody that does it better? Daniel had an extraordinary witness, and it's proven in the fact that every pagan king he served elevated him to positions of authority without exception. Which raises another question, and we won't get into it now, but do you ever think there were times when Daniel had to hold his nose? Totally. You don't get that high in a demonic kingdom, secular kingdom, and not have a few times to go, oh, okay, we'll just go over here and pretend I didn't see that. Yuck. He had cultivated the art of compromise so that he could maintain influence and yet not lose his soul. That's a challenge. Let's keep reading here. Daniel's conviction gets tested. Verse 10. This is my favorite verse probably in all of Daniel. One verse. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, what's the decree? Can't pray to anyone but King Darius for 30 days or be thrown in a lion's den. How many of you have seen a lion's den? We don't have them around right now, thankfully. We have social media, it's about as close as it comes, and it can feel like a lion's den sometimes. This is a den of lions that they've captured lions, they've put them in these places, and then they don't feed them so they get really hungry, and then people that violate the law, they toss in there like human jerky to get chewed on, and they typically put it in prominent places so you could hear the activity. Bone snapping, sinew tearing, and people screaming, ah! You're like, I should have brought my kid this morning. Well, I'm not sure you can bring your kid any morning, but this is Daniel, and it's great. There's parts of the story that didn't make it in the flannel graph story I got told in Sunday school we're going to see here in a little bit. And the purpose was to deter crime. What's that guy screaming for? He's being torn limb from limb by lions. Oh my goodness. What did he do? He disobeyed a law. How are you doing today? I'm good. I love the law. I'm going to obey the law because I don't want to be cat food. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God just as he had done before. Or 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and broke the law. Right? Because it was a law. Good thing he didn't have evangelical American Christians there talking to him. Hey, don't rock the boat here, buddy. It's our job to obey the law. If the king says it, we got to do it. That's what Paul said in Romans 13, right? Think about Paul or Daniel's options here. He could have obeyed the order for 30 days to pray to King Darius. He could have pretended to obey it, but not really in his heart, right? I'm not obeying it in my heart. He could have run away. He could have made an appeal to the king. He's done that before. He could have taken 30 days off from prayer and just waited it out. Like, you know what? I don't want to make a big stink about this, and quite frankly, this might put my promotion in jeopardy. And I don't want to make people feel awkward, and I don't want to hurt the witness of the church in Babylon here. And so I'll just not pray at all. He could have made his faith private and hide it. I'm going to pray, but I'll just close the windows here. No need to bring unnecessary persecution. After all, if I'm taken out, who will be salt and light in the kingdom? He could have made a big public protest stink to make himself a martyr with attention. You're gonna tread on me? Okay. Well, let's do this. I'll rally a coalition here, and hope your lion den's big enough for all of us. Or he could have ignored fear and lived in faith as he always had. Interesting to know. So obviously the text answers our question. Well, obviously it's okay at some point, sometime, somewhere, in some ways for Christians to disobey the law because Daniel does it. And then God articulates his express blessing on Daniel by rescuing him from the consequences that the king tried to enforce on him by saving him from the lion's den. And so obviously it was okay. And here's what's interesting to me is the obvious answer to the question, is it ever okay for a Christian to disobey the law, is uniformly across Christian thinking, yes. And you read, anybody familiar with Francis Schaeffer? Francis Schaeffer, brilliant Christian thinker, author in the 70s and 80s, ran L'Abri, this kind of Christian think tank over in Europe, Eastern Europe there. And one of the books he wrote, How Then Shall We Now Think, Christian Manifesto, massively popular Christian work in the 80s. The last 4 chapters in the Christian Manifesto, most people aren't aware of, was his articulation of not just the biblical case for, but the necessity of Christians exercising civil disobedience. This is 1983. 4 chapters building a case, biblically and historically, for why Christians are required in the day and age, in the secular age we live in, to exercise civil disobedience. I could do a whole sermon on it. I should probably do a podcast on it. It'd be really fascinating to just do a study in biblical history and theology and teaching in both Old and New Testament of accounts of followers of Jesus exercising fidelity to God, and it is expressed in civil disobedience to the magistrates they're currently under. The entire story of Christianity in the book of Acts is one of essentially warring against the government of their time, making war in the spiritual realm, being persecuted for their faith. There's not, I don't think you could find 5 Christian heroes of the faith historically that you could name for me that weren't in constant conflict with the governments that they lived under historically. Like, that's been the story of the church. And you and I haven't had to think critically about it before because we've never been told what we can or can't do in the worship of God. In 2020, we've been told when we can or can't meet. We've been told how many can come, and now we're being told what we can do when we gather. And no one's even batting an eye. It's staggering. So here's a grid that I wrote out for myself in May of this year in relationship to thinking about the Christian and the law. And this is shallow. This is just surface grid, but I'm going to give it to you so you can think about it, because I think we need to start thinking about it more critically as the church. There is profound legal theory underneath what is a law, what makes a rightful law. Paul says in 1 Timothy 1 verse 8, the law is helpful if it is used rightly. It's an interesting way to look at it. The law is helpful if it's used rightly. So here's a couple ways to think about the law that apparently Daniel used in his thinking. Number 1, a law can uphold righteousness. A law can uphold righteousness. Thou shalt not steal, the Bible says, and currently in most places it's illegal to steal, in our country. It can uphold righteousness. Number 2, a law can be silent towards righteousness. In other words, the Bible is very clear in relationship to your fidelity in marriage. It is an evil, unrighteous thing for you to cheat on your spouse sexually with someone else, either digitally or in person. That's a horrifically destructive, unrighteous act, and our laws are silent on that issue. So a law can uphold righteousness. A law can be silent towards righteousness, which is I'm not even arguing against. I'm just saying that's just a category of thinking. I'm not sure I would want it to be illegal because you can't legislate morality, right? But I am saying is you can do something that's legal in the eyes of our state or our country, but still destructive in every relationship that you have. A law, number 3, can undermine righteousness. So it can uphold it. It can be silent. It can undermine righteousness. How about the no-fault divorce laws? We talked about that a few weeks ago, right? In making it, it's like you burnt the toast, I'm out. You leave the toilet lit up, I'm gone. There's no need to work through conflict. There's no need to value covenant and commitment. If it gets hard, boom, rip cord, and I'm out. We have laws that undermine righteousness, like working through conflict toward resolution. Number 4, a law can promote or allow unrighteousness. Number 5, a law can defend unrighteousness, like abortion, where they will defend your legal right to do something unrighteous. And lastly, a law can demand unrighteousness. And thankfully, we have very few of these. But there have become cases where, employers are forced to, let's say, provide abortion pills. That's a conflict of conscience for them, and the law demands it. And so thankfully, because we live in a constitutional republic, they have legal means by which to challenge it because, and I'll note, we live in a very different time than the Medes and the Persians, thanks be to God. But did you know that you're required by the Constitution that you live under as a citizen to engage politically? If you see something being done that's wrong, you have not the right, you have an obligation to go, excuse me, don't consent. You have an obligation. If you're going to be a good citizen, you got to know the laws so you can engage in them and the means that we've created to do that to work for change. But here's what's interesting. You read Christian ethic books, and what they'll tell you is there ever a time where a Christian can disobey the law? And their answer will be, yes, if the law requires them to do something that would explicitly disobey a command of God. And that's a nice, clean, ethical answer to the question, can a Christian ever disobey the law? To which I think Daniel doesn't even come close to that strong a definition. Here's my question. What explicit law of God was Daniel obeying when he went to his house, opened his windows, and prayed 3 times a day toward Jerusalem? Anybody got a chapter and verse? What explicit command of God was he obeying when he prayed 3 times a day out the window to Jerusalem? You can't find it. What's the point? Daniel chapter 6, verse 10, is Daniel saying, I will know your laws so well and excel in keeping them so well that there will be no one else in the kingdom you would want to promote to be number 2 in all the Medo-Persian world. But if you tell me how to worship my God that violates my conscience, pound sand. That's what he's saying. There was no explicit law of God he was asked to violate in not praying publicly to Yahweh out a window 3 times a day. He's just like, you know what? I believe I have the sovereign right given by God, endowed by my Creator with the inalienable right to express my worship of God in any way I feel necessary. It's not your place to speak into that part of my life, O King. Hashtag pound sand. That's what Daniel's doing right here. Isn't that crazy? What's the big idea? Well, see, I've skipped over stuff here. I don't know where the crap we are. Where are we at here? Here it is. Here's the big idea. Know where your line is and be ready to die for it. Know where your line is and be ready to die for it. Look at verse 10. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, look what happens. It's not he wrestled with it. He contacted his attorney. He contacted a PR firm. He wrestled through the optics of what it would look like and the ramifications on his job at work. No. Daniel had already determined what he would be willing to hold his nose regarding and what he would not be willing to hold his nose regarding. And the stink on this law was above his ability to plug his nose, so he embraced it. He knows exactly what, he's not stupid. He knows this is a hit job. He's like, oh, they finally found a way to get me. Well, I'll show them. I won't pray for 30 days. He's like, okay. If I die, I die. He knows the law. He knows he's violating it, and he knows the consequences that are coming. And he does it anyways. Let me just ask you a question. Would your prayer life get you in trouble at work? Well, if I lose my job and I can't work, well, it's complicated. It's complicated. Like Lion's Den complicated? This was complicated. I have influence, I have authority, I have responsibility. I can protect weak people. I got the ear of the king. I have more influence than anyone on the planet other than the king himself. It's just 30 days, not a big deal. God will understand. A million excuses he could have made. He's like, no, pound sand. It is not your place as the king of the known world to tell me how I am to exercise the free expression of worship as my conscience demands. Chapter 6, verse 11, Daniel's critics. Let's see what happens next. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. What a great phrase. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. Interesting to note. Different government than Babylon. Babylon, the highest authority was the king himself. He could overturn things left and right. This is one step closer to what we would call a democracy. Of course, not as far as the Greeks would develop it later, but it's one step closer, saying even the king is under the law and can't change it once it's written. The king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. Verse 13. Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah. You want to talk about racism? There it is right there. Well, why would they bring that up? Want to undermine the king's confidence in his ability to trust Daniel. You know, one of those exiles from Judah. He's not us. He's not one of us. He's an exile. You know that, don't you? He's a circumcised exile. I mean, who knows if they didn't send him here as a spy. He pays no attention to you. Was that true? Not even close. Your majesty, order the decrees you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. What's the big idea? I had a very wise pastor tell me one time a few years ago, he said, Josh, you can never live in such a way as to keep the critics from making accusations. But you can live in such a way as to make the accusations baseless. Here's the big idea. Live in such a way as to make the accusations of critics baseless. They make the accusation and it falls flat because nobody in their right mind thinks Daniel doesn't give a flip about the king. He has expressed exclusive fidelity to the king alone for how many years to get to this point, and then he does what's loving to the king in reminding the king that, oh, by the way, you're king, you're not God. It would have been a breaking with the consistency of Daniel's faithful service to the king for Daniel to act in such a way as to make the king think he was God. And then we see Daniel's unflinching faith, verse 16. So the king gave the order. No, see, verse 15. Then the men went down as a group to King Darius and said to him, remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree edict of the king issues can be changed. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the king rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God. Was the king unclear about who was God when he made that bogus edict? No. He was living in a mirage and a dream, and Daniel's faithfulness to God woke him up from it. And he calls out, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? Here's the big idea. Faith that pleases God isn't up for sale given the circumstances. Another way to say it, faith that pleases God isn't political, it's prophetic. Our job isn't to check optics, but to obey God, even if it means lions. And I love how the king put it twice in the text. May the God whom you serve continually rescue you. Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to rescue you from the lion's den. Friends, what a wonderful thing to say, have something said about you. Oh yeah, that's Josh, that guy who serves God continually. Oh yeah, that's Sarah, that gal, she just serves God continually. Oh yeah, there's Johnny, that guy, he just serves God continually. I mean, no matter which way the winds are blowing, no matter what the circumstances may be, that guy, that gal just serves God continually. The faith that pleases God is not a faith that's for sale. The faith that pleases God is a faith that's grounded in conviction that there is no other God other than the one true God, and to act as if there is not loving to anyone on earth, nor is it being faithful follower of the God that you say you love. Verse 21, Daniel's deliverance. Daniel answered, may the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouth of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. What is that reminiscent of? The guys that came out of the fire without a whiff of smoke on them, right? Like we're not going to make it look like Daniel was in there like, wah, he's sweaty, tired, and clawed, and he's bleeding, but I made it. He comes out without a cat hair on him. What is that? That's just God showing off. You can throw my servant in the lion's den, and I'll pull him out without a scratch. What's the point? God delivers those who place their faith in him over their own ability to get around a situation. Does this mean that God will rescue you from every lion you're thrown in? No. Why do we know that? Because thousands of faithful Christians died at the hands, or paws, I should say, of lions. The big idea here isn't if you're faithful to God, he'll save you from the temporary lion's den. The big idea is if your faith is in God, he will snatch you without a scratch on you from the world that is currently a lion's den. Daniel, verse 24, his vindication. This is the part that isn't in the Sunday school story. Verse 24, at the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered the men, the women, and the children, and crushed all their bones. Now, did anybody have that told them in Sunday school? Hey, kids, Daniel got rescued. Yay! Hey, before you go home, you know those bad guys in the story? Their bones were crushed. And their faces were torn off. But that's the picture, right? Daniel, lion's den, pulls out, not a scratch on him. There's the men that had this done. Bring all of them and their wives and their children. So picture wives like, honey, what's going on? Well, a rough day at work, what's going on? Ah, lion's den. And before they hit the ground, lions tearing them limb from limb. What's the big idea there? Here's the big idea. God will throw down our enemies and crush all their bones. You read through the Psalms, it gets pretty violent. My God will break the cheek and crush the teeth of my enemy. That's the hope of the believer. That one day, somewhere, somehow, justice will be brought and God will defend his people. Not everybody gets delivered from the lion's den, friends. Not everyone gets out of this life with eternal life. Here's a side takeaway, men. Our decisions can punish our families. God's given Grace City Church a heart for men because we believe that men are the key to the family. I get emails from people saying, quit saying that, it's not true. Then go to another church. Men are the key to the spiritual health of a family, period. When men read their Bibles, when men go to church, when men love their wives, when men cherish their wives, when men love their children, when men disciple their children, societies flourish. When men ignore their Bibles, don't go to church, when men abuse their wives, when men ignore their children, when men can't keep it in their pants and control their sexuality, society is ravaged. Men, you make decisions with your sexuality, with your money, with your job, with your career, with your time, and all of those decisions have consequences. And many times your decisions punish your family. We gotta get that into our bones. When the men it's just statistically proven, when men read their Bibles, when men go to church, their family comes with them. When men flip off God, their families do the same. We want women to be loved, cherished, honored, protected, and to flourish. And that doesn't happen when men act like boys. What a graphic example of men's irresponsibility having devastating consequences on their family. Lions tearing them limb from limb. I wonder if they threw the children in first so the men could hear it. And then the wives so the men could hear it. So that before they died, they could experience a little bit of the consequence of their decisions. Men, maybe your family hasn't been thrown in a lion's den, but your choices have caused them just as much damage emotionally, spiritually. We got to get a little more serious about this business of being men because the consequences are staggering. Daniel's reach. Look at verse 25. We got to wrap this up. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and people, every tongue in the earth, may you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lion's den. Here's the big idea. Compromise does not spread the glory of God. Never underestimate the far-reaching effects of one act of courage. God can work with courage. God can't work with compromise. Lastly, Daniel's legacy. Look at this. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. 4 kings Daniel survived. What's the big idea? Anchored says you're never too young for things that matter, right? Our Anchored youth group. Daniel says you're never too old for things that matter. Just because you're old doesn't mean you're done. Ladies and gentlemen, your most valuable contribution might come at the end of your life. You know how old Daniel was here? 80 plus. We picture Daniel, landing in the lion's den. This is how Daniel went to the lion's den. You're like your dad? Yeah, like my dad. Right? The old Daniel limp. Jacob limp, actually, as we call it. Daniel was 80 plus years old when he's like, you know what? I haven't gotten this far to compromise on God now. So do what you may. I'm going to worship God. I'm going to pray 3 times a day. Come and get me if you want. What a profound example. So here's the key question for us. Wrap this up. The question for the Christian when it comes to whether or not they should obey or disobey a law that interferes with their God-given right to worship God, the question is never, what are the optics? The question is always, is he worthy? That's the question. Is he worthy of the cost that might come if I do this act? That's the equation the Christian runs. Is he worthy? If he isn't, then just don't bother with any of this. Why bother? If he is, and he is, then it might require us adjusting how we view the world. You see, but Daniel is, of course, pointing us to a better Daniel to come, isn't he? There would be another man who would live a life of noble integrity and be falsely accused by those who hated him because they couldn't find anything wrong with his life, be thrown into a grave and have it sealed, tame the lions of death, come out alive, emerge victorious over death, be promoted from the pit to the palace, and have his enemies thrown to their death. The man Jesus Christ. And here's what's crazy about Jesus, is the reality of it is all of you deserve the lion's den for violating not a king's law, but God's law with things you have done and said and not done and should have done and not said and should have said. What you deserve is the lion's den of God's judgment. And the better Daniel Jesus went into not his lion's den, your lion's den, and tamed the judgment of death in the form of a lion so that he could give you his victory and that you could, by grace through faith, experience life evermore. Is he worthy, friends? Is it even a question? How then shall we then live? The question that Francis Schaeffer posed to Christians in the 80s is still a relevant question for us today. And to help us answer that, I want to invite someone to the stage, and I want you to help me get him up here. He was served as a Chelan County Commissioner for many years here in Chelan County, is now serving as a state representative. Can you please help me welcome to the stage State Representative Keith Gaynor? Come on, get him up here. How are you, brother?
Well,
have a seat. Here's your microphone. Thanks for coming today and joining our family. Your lovely wife, Lisa, here is with you. Thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah. I wanted to just end our time with this study in Daniel because we're going to transition to chapter 7, and chapter 7 gets crazy with dreams and horns and unicorns, and I don't know what it means, so we'll probably just skip it. But we've gotten through the narrative parts of the story, and we're going to move into more of the prophetic parts of the story. And what's hit me about Daniel is how politically involved he was, and yet how faithful he was to God. And I think there's been this dichotomy sometimes that gets created by the church or by Christians that say, well, you can't be a Christian and be involved in politics. You can't be a Christian and you know, it gets kind of messy and right wing, left wing, you know, where does it land and all this kind of stuff. And I think the example of Daniel is just the opposite. It was because of his love for God, his faithfulness to God, that he chose to be very actively involved in a very atheistic and antagonistic culture, worldview, government, and he did it well. And one of my hopes from this series is that many, even in this room, might be prompted to go into politics with a heart to have an impact there for the kingdom. And so I know that's something that you've been passionate about. And so I want to just fire some questions at you. And we talked for about an hour and a half on the phone yesterday. It was so fascinating. I thought, oh my goodness, how can we squeeze all of that into this few moments? So I know we won't get to everything here. Maybe we could do a podcast later and get to some of that stuff. But tell us about your journey of faith. Tell us when you met Jesus, how that came about, and what kind of your journey with Jesus has been like since a kid.
Well, the first thing I would say is that I did see the flannel graph story of Daniel.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yes, we did.
Did they have the part where the kids go in their pit?
No, that was...
Okay, they skipped that. Yeah.
No, I was raised in a Christian family. Attended church, as a kid, and when I was about 6 years old, I gave my heart to the Lord. But it wasn't until I was in my teen years when I really realized how much God loved me, and it really became a transforming power in my life. It was one thing to go to church and be a good kid and do all the right things, but it was quite another to really experience the power of the Holy Spirit, working within my life, and that's probably was the turning point for me spiritually.
So, raised in a Christian home. Now, where'd you grow up? Upper Valley? Dryden. So grew up in Dryden, the booming.
Haven't strayed far.
Yeah. Oh, Dryden, yeah, a long ways. And so faith at a young age, high school, college starts getting real. When do you meet your wife, Lisa?
Well, I met her when I was a kid, but
Okay.
we weren't, it's not the childhood sweetheart story, but she can tell you the story much better than I can.
We'd love to hear that story sometime, Lisa, so you start working on that.
But I would say that, when our relationship began was when I was in college.
Okay. So then you taught in Moses Lake.
I did out of college, yes.
Yep. And then moved back to do what?
Well, I moved back to farm because growing up, I'd worked in the orchard all my life and decided that was definitely not the thing I wanted to do as a career.
Okay.
And it just seemed like the Lord had opened so many doors for me to pursue my education pathway, and I had intended to be an educator, administrator. That was kind of my thought, the direction I was going. But after teaching a couple years, I just really felt the call to come back. And I came back, one of the reasons I came back is to work with my dad, and it just seemed like a great opportunity.
So you come back, and what does he do?
He takes off. He goes and plants a church.
What are you doing, Dad?
So it was neat because I came back and we worked together for a few years, and then he felt the call to ministry, which was great because we were there. It created an opportunity for us, great place to raise our family, and the lifestyle gave me a great opportunity to get involved in community, and that was probably something that wouldn't have happened had I been, in education.
And so how many acres were you farming at the time your family's farming there in Dryden?
We've got a little over 90.
Okay.
So.
Pears, apples?
All pears.
All pears. So what was your first foray into politics, and why did you do it?
Well, I think the first thing was probably just a precinct committee officer in the Republican Party, and then I got on the Shasta-Dryden School Board shortly after we moved back. So that was my first elected office.
Okay. And then county commissioner.
With a long hiatus in between, because I felt like I had so many other things that I was involved in community-wise. It gave me great opportunities to be of service to the community. And then there was a point in time where I didn't feel that what I saw happening at the county level was that my interests as a grower, just as some of the principles that I feel strongly about were being represented by the candidates, and so I decided that I needed to run.
So when I asked you yesterday of why you decided to run, you stated that very thing. You said, I came to a point where, I think you said something like, was either put up or shut up.
And that's what I said.
Yeah. And so what I appreciated about that was there was really no desire for it. You mentioned, like, I was kind of, I was wishing someone else would step up, let them go do it, but no one was stepping forward. And so you step into the role, and how long were you a county commissioner?
16 years.
16 years. And what surprised you about that role?
Well, I just want to interject a little bit here in that when you become a public servant, your life really is not your own if you take it seriously, because you're serving the public, and you're constantly thinking in terms of how can I best represent my constituency.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not about you. It shouldn't be about you as the elected official. It should be about what you're doing to best serve the people that have elected you, put their trust in you. So probably the thing that surprised me the most about being a county commissioner was the expansive responsibilities that you have. I mean, you look at the county commissioner from the outside in, and it looks like it's not that big a deal. But once you get in office and you realize all the different committees and agencies that you're responsible for, departments, there's an awesome responsibility there. And I think that people need to be very serious in who actually runs for the office and then who we elect.
And 16 years as county commissioner, and then you decided to run for state representative. Why the decision to do that?
Well, that was not my decision either.
Okay. The reluctant public servant is...
Yes. I felt like after 16 years I'd done my,
You've given up the office.
My dues, toward is serving. And I was ready to somewhat retire from public service and just, find other ways to be involved. But the time came, it was really just about a week or within 2 weeks of filing, that, I was approached that, you need to run for the legislature, and the first thing I did was made a couple calls to people that I thought would really be good. And they said, well, no, I just don't want to do that. And once again, I couldn't see what I was envisioned happening if I didn't run. So I thought, well, Lord, if this is where you want me, I'm willing to do it. I'm willing to serve. And so, then I ran and obviously got elected, and I've just been reelected.
So what has been, yes? So what has been challenging or surprising about being a part of the state legislature?
I think the biggest thing is that it's so political.
I could have told you that, bro.
Well, you envision being elected as a representative, that you would be able to go to Olympia, you'd be able to, have dialogue, you'd be able to share the, insights from your, district and the things that are important, and the differences between rural Eastern Washington or just rural Washington and the Puget Sound core. And there's very little opportunity to really have that dialogue. So you really have to work hard to establish relationships and inroads with other people so that you do have that credibility. They do understand exactly why you feel the way you do. And some of it is, for me personally, there is a real spiritual basis to my thinking and the principles that I, uphold as far as government and that type of thing. But, there are just some nuances to a rural area versus an urban center. And when you have the majority of people trying to solve all your issues based on an urban mindset, it's not the same as, other parts of the state. So it's a real challenge to try and communicate that and represent that idea well.
What's it like? In the sermon we mentioned that I'm sure there was times that Daniel had to wrestle with compromise. And what's that like for you as a follower of Jesus first, who has a very serious relationship with Jesus? My first memories of you were at my grandparents' church, the Naz, and you leading worship and on the board and actively involved there. So not just a casual American Christian, but a committed follower of Jesus, husband, father, farmer, patriot, member of a local community, and now a politician. I don't even know what my question is, but are there times you wrestle with, do I compromise here? Do I not? Like, what's that like to walk the line of following Jesus, but yet being in a very secular and somewhat antagonistic world right now in relationship to Christianity?
Well, there are definite challenges because the things that I guess I think back to when President Bush was asked, what's it like to be a Christian?
Yeah.
And he said, until you've made the commitment and you live it, I can't really explain that to you. And I use that as an analogy to governing, where there are certain things about the principles that we uphold that are really not explainable to the world. And so when you're, you want to resist, some of the new laws that, as you mentioned earlier today here, the legislation and the way that it's gone as far as righteousness. If there's not an understanding of what righteousness is, you can't make good laws. And so, it's a difficult dialogue sometimes to have, because you're trying to explain the reason you can't support this law is because it's not affirming righteousness, when the frame of reference is not there on the part of the proponent of that legislation. So there are things, whether it was at the county level, not so much, because it's more grassroots things that are not as philosophically driven. But at the state level, that's all we deal with is basic philosophy of our society. And the kinds of issues that we deal with, if you don't have a firm foundation in your thinking, then you're going to be misled. You're going to promote things that are not good for your society, and it's hard to articulate that at times without bringing the spiritual component into it.
Yeah. Well, two questions, and then we'll let you be done here and go. The second question is, what's encouraging you right now? But the first question is, what's discouraging you right now? What are you seeing that's discouraging you? What are you seeing that are challenges that Christians are going to have to face in the coming days and weeks?
What's discouraging to me probably the most right now is that, the system that we have is a good system. Our founding fathers, from a federal standpoint, even the state of Washington, when you read the Constitution, there's some good thought behind it. But it's only as good as the integrity of the people that are embracing it or that are given the authority to enforce it. And if the integrity of those who are in office today, they don't understand or they don't come to, in this case, proclamations or whatever, with an understanding of the real integrity, the kinds of issues, the principles that we really want to see and have seen in the past. If it's not there, then your society is going to drift, and we're going to slowly continue down a real negative path. So that's discouraging to me. But what is encouraging is that there are a tremendous number of good, solid Christians that are in the legislature, and we may be in a minority, but if you and God constitutes a majority. So, so it's really important, and it's really incumbent upon us to daily seek God's wisdom to be lived out through us in the way that we govern. But I do have a number of good, solid Christian friends that are serving alongside. I'm privileged to serve alongside, and I'm grateful for that.
What do you wish the church would know? Last word. What would you want us to hear? What do you wish the church would be thinking about doing more in relationship to just kind of the political environment we're in right now?
Well, I think the biggest thing that the church needs to realize is that Sunday is a day to be equipped and to be empowered to get out the other 6 days of the week, to live in the world, but not of it, as you mentioned. And I think that we as a church have a tremendous calling, and it's pretty clear what our role ought to be. And if we're not involved, then how can we be impacting others? So to me, it's always there are a couple things that I think about is that we've been created to serve, as Jesus said, I came to serve, not to be served. Yeah. So that should be something that's uppermost in our minds. And then secondly, also that we're supposed to be that salt and light that is a transforming power to a society that needs the love of Jesus.
Amen. What can we be praying for you about?
I think for me, there are times when there is discouragement, and you wonder, where do we go from here? Because there's so many things that seem so obvious. There's some, the common sense kinds of things that ought to be happening, and they're not. So to me, it's just having the wisdom and the discernment to know that this is the path that God wants me to walk in. These are the words He wants me to speak. And I just need to have, the power of the Spirit within me living through me in order to really be the vessel and the voice that God wants me to be. So I would covet your prayers for that.
Yep. Can we do that? Mr. Garner, thanks for being here today with us. People wouldn't know this, but every time I've texted in the last 8 months, every time I've called, text right back, call me right back, answer my questions, explain things to me I didn't understand, give me insight I wouldn't have had or couldn't have known. I have experienced your heart to serve the public in how you've interacted with me, and I'm grateful for that. Lisa, we're grateful for you and the burden you carry of supporting your man, and we're grateful for your courage. We're grateful that you haven't pulled him off the field. No, get back out there, boy. There's still work to be done. And grateful for your life and your faithfulness. So, Keith, can I pray for you?
Sure.
And we'll let you go. I was going to have you pray to end our time, but I think we should pray for you. And so, Father, we come to you as a church family, and we lift up our brother. We pray that you will give him strength and wisdom, courage, fortitude, and conviction to be salt and light in what is oftentimes a very dark place. We pray for all of the believers that are in positions of authority in our state, that you would strengthen them and encourage them when they're discouraged, that you would show them the importance of their role, and that you would allow them to see the impact they're having. Lord, we pray for all of our elected officials, that you would give them supernatural insight, that you would give them wisdom from above, that you would grant them the gift of common sense, that you would grant them the gift of insight to sometimes in very, very challenging times, in very complex situations, make godly decisions, make right decisions that would allow our community to continue growing and flourishing. And Father, I pray if there would be any in this room right now or listening online who've been convicted about, I always gripe and whine, but I'm never involved. Or, I'm always talking about my elected officials, never praying for them. Lord, that you would cause all of us to accelerate our game, that we would be praying more, that we would be supporting more, that we would be calling and emailing more, and we would get engaged in the process. What a word for us. It's a good system, but it's only as good as the morality and the righteousness of the people living in the system. So, Father, would you cause us to be those kinds of people that are engaged in the process, bringing the prophetic edge of the gospel of truth to the process, bringing the love of God and love of people to the process, bringing in compassion and integrity and knowledge and wisdom like Daniel did to the process, that we might be viewed as an asset to our community. Father, I pray that you would strengthen our state representative to be there, not only representing his constituents and the people, but representing Jesus well. We're grateful for his courage. We're grateful for his conviction. And we're grateful for his example, Lord. May many follow in his footsteps, we ask. In Jesus' name, amen.